The bridal shower was held in Aunt Carol's backyard in Naperville, under a rented white tent strung with fairy lights. 40 women in pastel dresses eating tiny quiches off tiered trays, while Carol's daughter Jessica opened gifts wrapped in tissue paper that matched the centerpieces exactly. Renee Okafor had been to 11 of these showers over the past decade. Cousins, coworkers, sorority sisters, the slow accumulating tide of other people's beginnings, and had learned, somewhere around shower number 6, to arrive with her expression already arranged, a pleasant, absorbing calm she could hold for approximately 3 hours before it started to genuinely cost her something. Carol stood to give the toast just after the gift opening, champagne flute raised, her voice carrying the particular warmth she reserved for occasions where she got to be the one steering the room. "To all the women lucky enough to be loved," Carol said, looking around the tent with real affection, "and to those still waiting." She looked directly at Renee when she said it. Not glancing, not accidentally landing there, a direct, held look, timed and deliberate, the kind of look that required no further commentary because the whole tent understood exactly who it was for and exactly what it meant. Renee was 32, unmarried as far as her family knew, the last of her generation in the family without a ring, a fact Carol had been narrating at family gatherings for 3 years with a specific, performative sympathy of a woman who enjoyed being sorry for someone almost as much as she'd have enjoyed being happy for them. Renee smiled and raised her glass along with everyone else. It cost her nothing to do this anymore, or so she told herself. She had built, over 3 years, a kind of emotional callus specifically for these moments, a thick, functional numbness she could summon on command. What it actually cost her, what she didn't examine too closely because examining it would have required admitting how much energy the numbness itself consumed, was the sustained effort of performing a story about her life that was no longer true, for an audience that had no idea it was watching a performance at all. 2. Why Carol needed the story to be true. Carol Whitfield Reyes was 58, a senior nursing administrator at Lakeshore Memorial Hospital, a woman who had spent 30 years building a career in a field that routinely treated women, especially women who worked as hard and rose as far as she had, as fundamentally interchangeable, disposable, forever one budget cut away from replacement. She had married at 24, young by choice rather than circumstance, and had built her entire self-understanding around the idea that being chosen early and decisively was the foundation everything else got built on top of. Her own marriage, 29 years running, was steady rather than passionate, a partnership she'd made peace with by telling herself, repeatedly, that steadiness was simply what chosen matured into. Renee's unmarried status unsettled Carol in a way that had very little to do with Renee specifically and everything to do with Carol's own quiet, unexamined anxiety about a life organized entirely around the premise that being selected by a husband, by an institution, by a hospital board that had passed her over twice for a VP role she'd wanted badly, was the primary measure of a woman's worth. Watching Renee move through her 30s unmarried felt, to Carol, like watching someone question the entire framework Carol had built her identity on, and Carol responded to that discomfort the way people often respond to a worldview being quietly challenged, by doubling down on it publicly, loudly, at gatherings where an audience could witness her being right. She was not, in her own accounting, being cruel. She believed, with real sincerity, that she was voicing what everyone secretly worried about on Renee's behalf, that her toast was a form of concern dressed as commentary rather than what it actually was, a public accounting of a woman's worth performed for an audience, at that woman's expense, by someone who needed the ledger to keep balancing in her own favor. 3. What Carol didn't know. What Carol didn't know, what nobody in the extended family knew, was that Renee had been married for 14 months, in a small ceremony on a beach in North Carolina, 9 guests total, to a soft-spoken structural preservation architect named Theo Ashworth, whom she'd met 18 months earlier restoring a historic library building for the city where Renee worked as a grant-writing director for a regional arts nonprofit. The marriage was not a secret out of shame. It was a secret out of exhaustion, a specific, hard-won exhaustion Renee had accumulated over years of watching her family process every piece of good news through a lens of comparison and hierarchy rather than joy. She had watched her cousin Priya's engagement announcement 3 years earlier turn into a 2-week family debate about whether the ring was appropriately sized for the fiancé's income bracket. She had watched her own sister's pregnancy announcement get overshadowed within an hour by Carol's unsolicited commentary about the ideal spacing between children. Renee had understood, gradually and then completely, that sharing anything real with her family meant surrendering it to be measured, ranked, and used as ammunition in arguments that had nothing to do with her, and she had made a decision, sometime in the first months of dating Theo, that she wanted at least one part of her life to exist entirely outside that system. Theo had agreed to the arrangement without much resistance, partly because he understood family dysfunction intimately from his own side. His mother's family, the Ashworths, carried a very specific, very public weight in their region that Theo had spent his entire adult life quietly, deliberately trying to step outside of. 3 generations back, Theo's great-grandfather had built one of the first cardiac surgical practices in the region, and the family's subsequent philanthropic foundation had funded, among other things, the cardiology wing of Lakeshore Memorial Hospital, the same hospital where Carol had spent 3 decades climbing an institutional ladder, the same wing whose brass dedication plaque read, in letters Carol had walked past thousands of times without ever connecting them to anyone she knew, the Ashworth Family Cardiology Wing. Theo had never once mentioned this to Renee's family, because Theo had never once mentioned it to almost anyone. He worked as a preservation architect specifically because it let him build something meaningful with his hands, on his own merit, entirely separate from a family name that had opened every door he'd ever walked through before he'd had the chance to knock. He introduced himself as Theo. He drove a 12-year-old truck he'd restored himself. He had, in 14 months of marriage, never once brought up the wing, the foundation, or the specific scale of the family trust that would, eventually, make him, and by extension Renee, extraordinarily wealthy, because he was still, at 34, working out his own complicated relationship to money he hadn't earned and a name that preceded him into every room. For life outside the toast. Renee's actual life, in the months surrounding the shower, was full in ways her family had no access to. She was 6 months into a major grant campaign for the arts nonprofit, working to secure a $2.3 million federal preservation grant for a historic theater slated for demolition, work she found genuinely thrilling in a way she rarely tried to explain to people who assumed nonprofit work was a consolation career rather than a chosen one. She had a close, fierce friendship with her coworker Dana, the only person outside her marriage who knew the full truth about Theo, sworn to secrecy over 2 years of lunch break confidences that had become, in their own way, as important to Renee as any family relationship. She had a standing Thursday night pottery class with Theo, both of them terrible at it, a running joke between them about whose bowls collapsed more spectacularly. She had begun training for her first half marathon that spring, a goal that had nothing to do with anyone's expectations and everything to do with a private, stubborn curiosity about what her own body could do if she asked it to. She had, 3 months earlier, started fostering rescue dogs through a local shelter, currently on her 4th foster, a nervous, sweet-natured hound mix named Biscuit who slept curled against Theo's feet every night and who Renee suspected, with growing certainty, they were about to fail to give back. None of this existed in her family's understanding of her at all. In her family's understanding, Renee was simply the unmarried one, the still waiting one, a category rather than a person, and she had let that category stand for 3 years because correcting it would have meant opening a door she wasn't ready to open.
The driveway.
Theo picked her up from the shower that evening rather than Renee driving herself, an arrangement made only because her car was in the shop that week, an ordinary, logistical decision with no strategy behind it at all. He pulled into Carol's driveway at 7:15 in his old restored truck and waited with the window down, scrolling through a preservation trade publication on his phone, while Renee said her extended goodbyes inside. Carol, walking guests to their cars, saw him through the front window before Renee had even reached the door, a man she didn't recognize, waiting in a driveway she associated exclusively with family, and something in her, some old habit of surveillance she'd honed over decades of managing a hospital floor, made her stop and look more carefully. She watched Renee walk out to the truck. She watched Theo lean across to open the passenger door from the inside, an old habit of his that had nothing to do with the door being broken, and everything to do with a small, consistent gesture of care he performed without thinking about it. She watched Renee laugh at something he said before she'd even fully closed the door. Carol had her phone out before the truck had pulled out of the driveway. 6. The call. "Who is that man?" Carol asked, calling Renee's mother Linda, before Renee had even reached the end of the block. "What man?" Linda, watching a rerun of a home renovation show, hadn't been paying close attention to the driveway. Picking Renee up.
Just now.
Older truck, dark hair, looked, I don't know, familiar somehow. "Did you know she was seeing someone?" "No idea," Linda said, and this was, in fact, true. Linda had suspected, vaguely, over the past year, that something in Renee's life had shifted, some new lightness in her voice on their weekly calls that Linda hadn't pushed to identify, partly out of respect for whatever boundary Renee seemed to be maintaining, and partly, if she was honest with herself, out of a mild, low-grade fear of what pushing might uncover about how far her daughter had pulled away from the family's daily orbit. Carol, unsatisfied, did what she'd increasingly become accustomed to doing when curiosity struck. She pulled up a reverse image search feature on her phone, cropped from a photo she'd taken through the window without quite deciding to take it, a habit of documentation she'd carried over from a career built partly on paper trails and incident reports. The search took a moment. Carol stood in her own driveway, guests still filtering past her with polite goodbyes she barely registered, staring at her phone screen as it populated results. A handful of professional photographs, a Preservation Society newsletter, a regional business journal profile from 4 years earlier headlined, "The Quiet Air Rebuilding Historic Landmarks, One Building at a Time," featuring a photograph of Theo Ashworth standing in front of a half-restored Carnegie Library, and beneath it, a paragraph identifying him as a great-grandson of Dr. Elias Ashworth, whose family foundation had, among numerous regional philanthropic commitments, funded the construction of Lakeshore Memorial Hospital's cardiology wing in 1987. Carol's own hospital, the wing she had walked past for 30 years. The brass plaque she had stood beneath during 100 staff meetings and donor tours, reciting the Ashworth name to visiting dignitaries with the practiced, slightly bored reverence of someone reading off a fact she'd never once connected to a living, breathing person she might actually meet. Carol dropped the phone. It didn't break. It landed screen up in the grass beside the driveway, still glowing, but the drop itself, sudden and involuntary, was the first honest reaction Carol had had all evening, a small, physical acknowledgement that something fundamental in her understanding of the last several years had just come apart. 7. What Carol did next. She did not call Renee that night. She sat with it, uncharacteristically, for 4 days, a silence that surprised everyone who knew her, because Carol was not, by nature, a woman who sat with things quietly. What Carol was doing, during those 4 days, though she wouldn't have described it this way to anyone, was recalculating an entire narrative she'd been narrating publicly for 3 years. She had stood up at a bridal shower and pitted a woman who was, it turned out, married to a man whose family named Carol had spent 3 decades reciting with professional deference. She had positioned herself, repeatedly, as the one with the clearer view of who deserved sympathy and who deserved celebration, and the ground beneath that positioning had just shifted in a way that forced an uncomfortable question. How much of her certainty about Renee's life had ever actually been about Renee, and how much had been about Carol needing someone in the family to occupy the still waiting category so that her own choices could keep feeling correct by comparison? It was Renee's mother, Linda, who finally broke the silence, calling Renee on a Wednesday evening with a voice that carried an unusual, careful hesitancy. "Carol saw a picture," Linda said, "of the man who picked you up. She looked him up. She says his family's name is on a wing at her hospital." Renee, standing in her kitchen with biscuit curled against her feet, felt the specific, strange relief of a long-held tension finally releasing, mixed with an equally specific dread about what came next. "His name is Theo," Renee said. "We've been married 14 months. The silence on the lines stretched long enough that Renee checked to see if the call had dropped. 14 months, Linda said finally, her voice thick. You've been married 14 months, and I didn't know. 8. The confrontation. Carol called 2 days later, and Renee, watching the name appear on her screen, chose, deliberately this time, not out of the old numbness but out of a clear-eyed decision, to answer. I saw the photo, Carol said, skipping any preamble. The article. Is it true? The hospital wing. It's true, Renee said. His great-grandfather funded it. Theo's never once brought it up to me as anything other than a complicated piece of family history he's spent his whole adult life trying to build an identity separate from. He drives a 12-year-old truck, Carol. He works 60-hour weeks restoring old buildings for a non-profit salary. I didn't marry a wing. I married a man who happens to be connected to one, and who spent his entire life trying to make sure that connection isn't the first thing anyone knows about him. You could have told us, Carol said, and there was real hurt in her voice now, tangled uncomfortably with something that sounded almost like the beginning of shame. At the shower. I stood up there and I said, Renee, I said that in front of everyone and you just sat there. I sat there because you'd said versions of that same thing at every family gathering for 3 years, and I'd stopped believing that correcting you would change anything, Renee said. You didn't need me to be married to stop saying it, Carol. You needed to stop needing someone in this family to be the cautionary tale, so your own choices could keep feeling like the right ones by comparison. That's not about who I married. That's about you. Carol was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its usual certainty. I don't know how to hear that without feeling attacked. I'm not attacking you, Renee said. I'm telling you why 14 months went by without you knowing something this big about my life. It's not because I'm sneaky. It's because being known by this family has never once felt safe. I built one part of my life somewhere you couldn't reach it, and I'm not sorry about that, even now that you know. 9. What the wing actually meant to Carol. In the weeks that followed, Renee learned something about Carol's reaction that complicated her own understanding of it. Not an excuse, exactly, but a fuller picture. Carol had been passed over, 18 months earlier, for the hospital's VP of Patient Services role, a position she'd wanted badly and had, by every internal metric, earned. The role had gone instead to a younger administrator with fewer years but a stronger relationship with the hospital's board. A board that included, Carol now understood with a fresh, bitter clarity, members connected to exactly the kind of old regional money the Ashworth family represented. Discovering that her own niece's husband belonged, however reluctantly, to that world had detonated something in Carol that had nothing to do with Renee's marriage and everything to do with 30 years of watching institutional power move along lines she'd never had access to, no matter how hard she worked or how long she stayed. Her cruelty at the shower, Renee came to understand, hadn't been really about Renee's marital status at all. It had been a proxy battle in a much older, much more painful war Carol had been quietly losing for years, a war about whose effort got rewarded and whose got overlooked, and Renee, unmarried and visible and safe to comment on, had simply been standing in the blast radius of a resentment that predated her entirely. This understanding didn't erase what Carol had said at the shower. It didn't undo 3 years of public, performative pity delivered at Renee's expense. But it gave Renee something she hadn't expected to find, a version of Carol that was smaller and sadder and more human than the confident, cutting aunt who'd raised a champagne glass and looked directly at her, and that fuller picture made forgiveness possible in a way pure resentment never would have. What was lost? Renee and Theo did eventually meet the extended family properly, an awkward, overcorrected dinner 6 weeks later where Carol, visibly working hard to recalibrate, asked Theo detailed, slightly performative questions about historic preservation techniques, and Theo answered them with the same quiet patience he brought to everything. Clearly uncomfortable with the sudden interest, but too kind to make anyone else uncomfortable in return. What Renee understood, watching the dinner unfold, was that something had been permanently altered that no amount of future warmth could fully restore. For 14 months, her marriage had existed in a private, unmeasured space, free of her family's comparative arithmetic, free of any question about whether Theo's worth as a husband was connected to his family's name or his own quiet, unglamorous choices, a rare, protected thing Renee had built specifically because she'd understood, correctly, how quickly her family would contaminate it with hierarchy and comparison the moment they found out. That protection was gone now, permanently. Every future family gathering would carry, somewhere beneath the surface, an awareness of the wing, the foundation, the money Theo had spent his life trying not to be defined by, an awareness Renee had specifically built her whole approach to the marriage around avoiding, and had lost the moment Carol's reverse image search returned its first result. She had gained something too, an aunt working, awkwardly but genuinely, toward a kind of honesty Carol had likely never practiced in her adult life. A family finally getting to know Theo as he actually was rather than not knowing him at all. Her mother, tearful and apologetic on a phone call 2 weeks after the discovery, asking Renee real, curious questions about her actual life for what felt like the first time in years. But the specific, unbothered privacy of those 14 months, the version of her marriage that had existed for no audience but the two of them, was gone, and Renee understood, driving home from that awkward recalibration dinner with Theo's hand resting on her knee and Biscuit asleep in the back seat, that she would carry a small, quiet grief for that lost privacy for a long time, even as she found herself, against her own expectations, glad that the door had finally, however messily, come open.